Hi, my name is Megan E. Freeman, and I am the author of this book, Alone, a middle grade novel in verse that was just released in January by Simon & Schuster, Aladdin. And I'm really happy to be here today with other members of the class of 2K21 books to talk about world building as a craft and part of writing. We're going to each introduce ourselves and then we'll jump into the questions.
Hi, I'm Jessica Vitalis. My book is The Wolf's Curse, which comes out September 21st with Greenwillow HarperCollins. And it is the story of a 12-year-old boy who catches a great white wolf steal his grandpapa's soul. I am also really excited to be here and talking about world building with all of you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Payal Doshi, and I'm the author of Ria and the Blood of the Nectar, which is a story about 12-year-old Ria Chetri, whose twin brother goes missing on the night of their 12th birthday. And then Ria has to embark on this secret and thrilling quest to find him. There's magic, there's secrets, there's betrayal, there's a villain, there are evil creatures, and there's a lot of heart and friendship. Ria and the Blood of the Nectar releases June 15th by Mango and Marigold Press. And I'm very excited to be here chatting with all of you.
And hello, I am Sam Taylor, the author of We Are the Fire, out now from Macmillan. It's about two fire-wielding teen soldiers in love who are pitted against each other as they fight against the Empire who kidnapped them as children. It's full of fire magic and twisted alchemy and gray morals. If you like An Ember in the Ashes, or if you like The Legend of Spartacus, you might like this book. I'm also excited to be here as a fantasy writer. World building is one of my great loves.
Great. Well, so Sam, I'm going to throw you the first question because the first question is what inspired the world and the setting of your book? And since yours is the high fantasy and world building is something you love so much, I'd love to know how you even begin to approach it.
So this book started because I was really angry and I wanted to watch something burn. The day job I had at the time was run by some pretty corrupt people. And I wanted to make things right, but I didn't really know how. I didn't know really who to trust or who to turn to. So I turned to writing to vent out those emotions. And I wanted to create a world that had fire magic because I wanted to watch something burn. And I wanted to create these situations with young characters who were also felt trapped by their circumstances. And they were trying to figure out the right choices and they weren't always clear or easy to come across. So, starting with the fire magic, one of the things in fantasy is you have to decide, how does this magic come about? Is it something they're born with? Is it something they go to school and study for? How do they get it? And I knew I didn't want these young characters to be born with their powers. I wanted the powers to have been pushed upon them. I didn't want them to have chosen these fire powers, but that they had been given them or forced to have them. So from there, I had to start spinning questions about this world. Like, what kind of a world would be forcing fire magic onto young soldiers? Why would these young soldiers be made to fight for causes they didn't believe in? How were these powers given to them? So I just kept playing around with the different ideas, and from that, I came up with this culture that has turned to fire as their source of strength for their warfare and fighting against the nation that was originally oppressing them. They used alchemy to get the fire powers onto these young teen soldiers. So I studied a lot of alchemy from our world, but in my book, it's not turning metals into gold or finding the elixir of life. It's taking these very incendiary chemicals along with some chemicals and minerals that were used in our world's alchemy to create these young fire soldiers to be able to have power over flame. And then they're kidnapped from their homes, from nations that the Vesima country has conquered, and claiming these young soldiers as the price of what the conquered nations owe the oppressor, and using them in order to build up their army in order to cement their strength. And they use the young kids because they found out that when they're using the alchemy and injecting the young soldiers. It works better when you have kids who are still developing rather than from adults. So I just was asking myself lots of questions and trying to get to the root of like, how would these powers have come about? What kind of a nation would be even doing this in the first place? How do the other people respond to it? Just lots of what if questions, lots of storytelling, made up lots of folklore for this book as well.
Mhm. Wow. So Pael, did you know Sam started with questions and crafted the world, or as she started to answer these questions for herself? Did you have the same sort of process, or did you already know some of the answers going in? Oh, you're muted.
No, it was really cool listening to Sam because my process was very different. I did not start with so many questions. And in fact, that's a good tip for writers to start with questions, because I wrote myself not into a dead end as such, but I'll explain. So anyway, when I had the idea to write the book, and I knew that I wanted it to be a fantasy book, my biggest inspiration to write fantasy was I love fantasy anyway, but also you don't find too many books with South Asian kids going off on adventures and being heroes and having magic and saving realms, and and I wanted to do that and change the narrative a little bit. Because kind of with underrepresented minorities, we get sort of compartmentalized into having more struggle stories, which are very relevant, but there's also another dimension, as there are several more to our stories. So that's the premise of why I decided to write fantasy. And then what I knew instantly was that I wanted to set my book, the India or the earth part of the book, in Darjeeling, because Darjeeling is famous for its tea. And so you can only imagine there are rolling tea plantations. It's in the northeast part of the country. You have the Himalayas as the backdrop. It gets wintry cold. India's tropical, so we don't get very cold weather except for the north, but here you do. It's a very dreamy landscape, and I wanted to write about a place that isn't usually talked about when you think of India. So for me, Darjeeling was instant. And then when it came to my fantastical land of Astranthia, I wanted it to be lush. I wanted the whole book to feel very lush and immersive. I love reading those kinds of stories where the setting is another character almost. I wanted it to feel tangible in a sense, like smell it, maybe, feel it. So Astranthia is very lush too. And so that was my very first foray into world building. I wanted to just create these very lush landscapes for both of them. And then when it came to the magic, I had them, born with magic, but they didn't know it in the beginning of the book. And that's how I sold my book. And, eventually Ria, discovers that she has magic and stuff like that. And then when I was in my first developmental edits with my editor, she asks me, so, Ria and Rohan, who are the main characters of the book, have magic. And we obviously, it's not much of a spoiler, but yes, she's a royal, she is a princess, she has magic. So she's like, so only do just the rich people, the royals, have magic? And what about the common folk? And I said, no, the common folk don't have magic, just the ones who are born into royalty have magic. So she says, so are you then sending the message that the rich and powerful are lucky enough to have magic and the poor not so much? And I was like, oh my gosh, no. I didn't even realize that. Like now it seems so obvious as I say it, but when I wrote the book, again, subconsciously, the books that you've read and just these sort of narratives that have been spun to you and, have just entered, so it just comes out like that. And so so this book was completely done, right? And I had to go back and I changed it so that the characters, so that everybody was born with magic, but you needed to, in this magical land of Astranthia, whether you're royal or you're a commoner, but you needed to unlock it. You needed to personally go through certain or overcome certain obstacles and challenges and prove your worth to unlock bits of your magic. And so there are some who wouldn't be able to do that and some who do. and it requires a great deal of sacrifice and, again, all of that. So that was my whole process. So I kind of had to backtrack a little bit, but, lesson learned. But yeah, so that was my whole world building magical experience.
It's interesting, isn't it, that Sam, you started knowing that there was going to be this fantastical element, and Pael, you started with a setting, an actual realistic geographical setting, and then created from there, from those two different places. So Jessica, how was your process different or similar to either of these?
I think maybe my process was sort of exactly in the middle. So what happened for The Wolf's Curse was I was looking for an idea, and I was scanning my bookshelves, and I was inspired by The Book Thief, Marcus Zukak's beautiful book. And I thought, wow, that's just a super cool idea to use death as a narrator, but of course it's already been done, and I really don't want to write about Nazi Germany. That's not my wheelhouse. So I thought, okay, well, why don't I take death as a narrator and throw it into a different setting? And so I did that, and I wrote this, I wrote an entire novel, an entire first draft in like 30 days. And it was sort of this vaguely European nondescript setting. And when I got done, I sent it to a trusted beta reader, and she said, it's fine, but it's not great. And I realized that she was right. And there was actually no death in the entire story, even though death was the narrator. So I threw the entire book out. And when I started on my second draft of this book, I realized one of the things that I had to do besides sort out this whole death business was come up with a more defined setting. So I had attended school in Germany for a year when I was in high school. And then I had also recently returned from a trip in France. And the village I lived in Germany was this very quaint, small seaside village. And so in my mind, I had always kind of wanted to set a story there, but I was also kind of obsessed with France at the time. So I decided I was going to take my German seaside village and move it to France. And then at the same time, I had to deal with this issue of death because I really didn't want to write about death, but my book was going to be about death. So as soon as I realized that I was going to be in a fishing village, I started doing research on death rituals around the world, and in particular, sort of medieval Renaissance death rituals. And I came up with so many cool things that really made me realize that death around the world doesn't look like it looks here in the United States for many of us. And as soon as that clicked, I realized that I could take my setting and I could build an entire world of death rituals around my setting. So I was able to create a village where they believe that when you die, you use literal feathers that are buried with you to fly up to the sea and the sky, and that the stars that we see at night are actually lanterns lit by our loved ones as they sail into eternity. So the setting really became crucial for my world building.
Wow. Don't you just want to stop everything and go read all of these books immediately?
Well, I've been lucky enough to read all of yours, and I feel so lucky. They're fantastic. And I love hearing the story behind them. It's so funny how we all come at it differently.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And in the one that I wrote, which is the only contemporary realistic, some people have, it skews ever so slightly dystopian just because of the premise through which the main character finds herself alone. So the premise of my book is that a middle school girl tells her parents, she lies to her mom and says she's going to spend the night with her dad. She lies to her dad, says she's going to spend the night at her mom's, and she really is going to have a secret sleepover with her friends that no adults will know anything about. And at the last minute, her friends can't come. And when she wakes up the next morning, she's completely alone. The entire town has been evacuated. And it was inspired by Island of the Blue Dolphins, which has a very, very specific world and historical and geographical setting off the coast of Southern California. And the question that inspired me to write the whole book was, what if a kid was left behind alone in Colorado, where I live, and had to figure out all the things that the character in Island of the Blue Dolphins had to figure out? And so I, sort of like you, Pael, I had a very clear geographical setting that I was going to, that was inspiring the book in many ways. And then to figure out how that setting was going to interact, because the other challenging thing with my story is that she's the only character for 98% of the book. There is a little bit of interaction with her parents and her friends in the beginning, but very little. And then she has a companion in the form of a Rottweiler, a big, wonderful dog, but there's no one for her to talk to. There's no one for her to interact with. And so the setting really does become incredibly important, both to her emotional and psychological experience, but also to her physical experience. Because she's alone for so long, it turns out to be almost 3.5 years, that she has to figure out how to survive with the climate and the weather and the seasons and all of the challenges that are inherent in living in Colorado, where you have wild animals and you have tornadoes and you have storms and blizzards and things like that. So in many ways, the setting contributed hugely to the plot. And I was actually thinking about that as I was listening to each of you about how hard it is to talk about world building without talking about plot. And to separate them feels a little bit artificial. And yet it's helpful to think about them in discrete ways, because I had my plot completely outlined and then had to go back in and fill in setting and details. And one of the things that I did to do that was really think about the five senses. And if we're thinking about this, our conversation here, as something that might be helpful to other writers, thinking about the five senses is really helpful to me. And looking through the whole draft and saying, where have I talked about something she smells? Or where, because it's easy to talk about things that you see, and it's pretty easy to talk about things that you hear, but the other senses are often overlooked. So what is the temperature of the cup that she's holding? Or what is the temperature of the breeze? Is she feeling air? Is she feeling wind? Is it dry? Is it humid? All those kinds of sensory details that contribute to world building in really subtle ways. And the other thing, it's interesting that you threw out your whole first draft, Jessica, because, or your whole first book in a sense. And God bless the beta readers that tell us the truth, right?
Right.
So helpful.
Worth her
But
weight in gold.
Exactly right. I wrote the whole first draft of my book in prose and then went back and rewrote the whole thing in verse. And the form also really helped with the world building for me, because I could write a whole poem just talking about the season that we were in or the weather that we were in, which helped with passage of time and all those things that are secondary to plot but are critical to the reader being able to access the world that we're trying to create. So it's really interesting how the ways in which our processes were similar and different, and yet how distinct and totally unique our books are, one from the other. So I have that question about how all of you incorporate details in, and what kinds of details you focused on in order to enrich this world for the reader. I don't know if any of you are inspired to just jump in with that one.
Sure, I can jump in. I actually wanted to say, Megan, I love that you are here with a novel in verse, because I was wondering about that earlier, how the process would be similar and different. And I think it's really fascinating when you mention that you can write an entire verse about, or an entire poem about the setting, because we can't really get away with that. So
Right.
the way that we include setting when we're writing in prose, or the way that I look at it, is I really try to focus on looking at the world through the eyes and the lens of the character. And I try to get the setting and the world building to do the heavy lifting for me in terms of the character development. So when I think about something like an example, my main character, Gage, is 12, and he's been heavily sheltered and hidden for a good portion of his life. At one point in the story, he has the chance to go to the market for the first time since he was very, very little. But he doesn't notice the wonderful smells and the beautiful colors and all the different noises. Instead, he's fixated on the dead raccoons that are being sold for food and the dead fish with their glassy eyes. And so because I'm looking at it through his lens, he's very, very scared. He's terrified. His life is in great danger. He's focusing on the things that are sort of feeding that fear. And I, as the author, can use that then to establish tone and establish setting.
I love that, because I do a very similar thing where in Rhea, when she portals into Astranthia, obviously she's never been to this place before, and then she meets this, like sweet, charming sort of, hustler kid who's selling jewelry, but also is like, oh, I can be a tour guide, and and so she tells him that, why she's there, she's come to look for her brother, and keeping in mind always that her main motive and her mission is to find her brother. She keeps asking him questions that could possibly, give her clues, but at the same time, from the corner of her eye, she's like, what are those? and so then it gives me the opportunity to then explain the types of houses that are so different there, so different from, what they are like on Earth versus in Astranthia. And then, Zarantha, who is from Astranthia, will give this explanation, and she'll be like, oh, okay, but won't dwell on it too much, but just enough for the reader to get a sense of the setting instead of just info dumping, exposition, like, okay, now we're walking through this, and now we're walking through that. So I find that can, be helpful. And then what I think, even in terms of, I looked at this question as, we're creating these fantastical worlds that sometimes can seem too fantastical. So the way I kind of sometimes root it back into reality, or bring the reader back, especially since we're talking about middle grade also, I would, like, I try and use inspirations from actual beings on Earth, or animals or plants or whatever, and give them a little twist to kind of make it more imaginative for the kids, so that they would actually be able to picture it, versus just, coming up with an inventive name and a fictitious everything. It's very hard to explain something like that unless you're visually watching it on screen or something like that. So then, for example, I have this little creature, which I call the clump. It's basically just a tuft of grass that has legs, and it can scurry about. And that's pretty easy to picture, but you instantly, go like, okay, this is fantasy. This isn't Earth. So I try to do that. And it's funny. I realized for the previous question, I did mention that when it came to the setting, my magic is driven by flora. So the setting played such an important role initially that it even it entered the basis of the magic is the blood of the nectar, which exists in every single plant, tree, and every flora in Astranthia. So yeah, that's my advice on kind of keeping it a little real when you're talking about fantasy.
I love that, and I really love the your point about the names that you choose to call things, because I think Megan probably doesn't have this much luxury, but as fantasy writers, we can really use the names to build our world. So for me, instead of calling the cemetery because it's the seaside, it's the wharves. And instead of the priest that does the funeral release like ceremony, it's the steward. And so we have the luxury of being able to create words that create more of a sensory detail or a world for our readers. Yeah. Sam, what about you?
I was going to say, similar to Payal, I did something similar with the fire magic and the alchemy in my world, keeping it a little bit grounded in our world's reality, but putting kind of fantasy twists on it to build the magic, but starting with something that is a little more known here, or that readers might have encountered, at least even just in like reading or history, to help it not seem quite so strange or quite so outlandish. So, and I have the story, the alchemy that's in the story is presented through one of the main characters, Oksana, who she knows chemistry. She's worked with chemistry a bit as a kid. So she's the one who's able to suss out and, figure out, hey, something strange is going on with the alchemist. And she's able to go into his lab and mess around with chemicals and figure out what this man is up to, because my characters have been in this setting for years and years. So I don't have the opportunity through them to be experiencing the world along with the readers for the first time. So I had to really think about, how am I going to present this world building that isn't new to them, new to the readers, but not new to them. So that's going back to the great points of presenting the settings through the eyes of the characters. What would they notice? What don't they notice? And what do the details they pay attention to say about them and their characterization and their character arcs?
Yeah, and so a minute ago I was saying how world building and plot, it's impossible to talk about them without talking about each other, but it's also impossible to talk about world building without talking about character development, right? Because it's all in service to itself all the way around. It's funny, I was thinking, Payal, when you talked about having a character who can ask questions, and then by answering you get to reveal more to the reader. In my current work in progress, which is, it's historical, but it's still realistic. It's set in deep South Texas, which is where my husband and his family are all from. and there's all kinds of, it's another world. It's just an incredibly rich culture. And so I created this character of a librarian who is from Ohio and doesn't know anything about it, so that I can explain things to the reader, right? So when they say something about going somewhere and she says, "What's that?" then they can explain it to her, and it works beautifully. And I remember, I don't know if you all watched West Wing when it was on in the 90s, but CJ or somebody was always saying, "Can you explain this to me?" Like, I remember the episode where she said, "Can you explain the census to me?" And I thought, okay, great. So that we're now going to explain it to the entire audience, right? But that's a really great device. It's really
a
helpful.
great device. It's tried and tested, and sometimes you don't have to reinvent the wheel, especially
Right.
when it can fit your story. Like, unlike Sam's, that would be weird to suddenly be like,
Right.
explain to me the
Right.
definition of this, how the alchemy works. It's like, what have you been doing since about 16, 17 years?
Right.
Explain to me how we became fire soldiers.
Yeah. How did that happen? What is this?
Right.
Exactly.
You could have forgotten that part.
Right. Right.
But similarly, Megan, like Sam, you too didn't have the luxury and alone to do that.
That's right.
Because
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Her conversations are
We
with
were
herself.
seeing the world through her eyes for the first time.
Right. Right.
But and again, like Sam said, we all touched upon it, but I think it's really important to reiterate that there's so much character personality that we can establish by talking about the things that character notices and the reactions other characters can have to that. You could create a really great dynamic and also show more of a character just by, and do all three things together: move the plot, move the characters, as well as the setting.
Okay, so I have a question about that, because it's also a question of balancing moving the story forward and not, I mean, you could write a whole book just describing the world, right? And especially for the three of you who are inventing worlds out of whole cloth, how did you balance the temptation to go way into detail that actually wasn't in service of the plot? Like, how do you figure out how much does the reader need to really grasp and imagine the world you're creating versus how much is too much and now we've lost the arc of the story? I'm curious about that.
For me, it was a lot of trial and error, presenting this complicated high fantasy world. The first few chapters are always the hardest to write because I'm trying to figure out, what do the readers need to know and what do they not need to know? So it was just a lot of trial and error, a lot of feedback from critique partners and my editor, people who I can trust to figure out, what do readers need to know from the get-go, how to fold that in. Some of it just comes as characters are moving through the scenes. Some of it comes from trusting the readers. I found that you really don't need as much as you might initially think. So as you revise the story, as you have conversations with critique partners and beta readers, you figure out what is confusing to them, where are areas that you can just feed in a little more information, what is information that was confusing because it wasn't a detail they needed to know at that point. So it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You need to get input from other writers and people that you trust who can help you figure out, because you as the writer, when you're creating the whole world and it's all in your mind and you're trying to just dump it out on the page, you need the help of other people to sort through the details that are necessary.
Definitely. For me, what helped was that because it's such a quest-based story, I tied the different parts of Astranthia to their different obstacles. So at one point, they haven't been able to find out anything about Rohan. And so Zarantha says, "Oh, we should go to the Whispering Walls." And it's like, what's that? So then it's like they move to this other fantastical, place where I don't want to say too much, but there's these cool things that, again, fantastical things that happen there where they could possibly learn something about Rohan. So that gives me, so it moves the plot along, but at the same time, we see a different part of Astranthia and sort of, again, reiterates the fact that it's a fantasy world and there's, so much of, there's magic and stuff like that. What was hard for me especially wasn't so much the info dumping on the world building as it was explaining the magic system. Because they're always so complicated, right? Because it's not just a simple magic system. It's like, this is the basis, but condition 1, condition 2. And then like, I now have like, you got to lock 3 levels to get out. So how do you, so it just gets so complicated. And at what point do you let the reader know? And at that point, do you give them all the information? And then that's where I think what Sam says makes a really good point there, is that other readers, your beta readers, are really good at then pointing out, paragraphs which are just like, no, that's too much, or I didn't understand. And then also I find, for me, when I read aloud the chapters, when I'm close to like, okay, this chapter is good. I've included everything that I wanted to include. The sentences feel good. Like, all right, now let me read it. And I sometimes even take a day or two apart from that chapter to then read it, and then I read it aloud, and then you realize that, okay, like we've stopped at action point here to now explain a couple of things, but then we're just explaining, and then I find that I have then really tried to bring us back to that original point to remind the reader that's where we were at. And so then it's like, no, something needs to go. So maybe pull out some of the exposition, add it as they're walking towards a place into like dialogue. So there is movement, but you're also getting that piece of information. So yes, you definitely don't get it at the first shot, and it goes through a lot of revision, read alouds, revisions, and then just trusting your instinct as well.
Yeah, for sure. The Wolf's Curse is actually my 6th novel. So I was really the queen of info dumping when I first started writing, because I thought that's what you did. You sat down and you wrote everything you knew or thought about the story. So, through the course of writing, right.
Yeah.
These enormous books. So, so it was a lot of trial and error, but I find now that I'm a chronic underwriter. So the point Sam made about relying on your beta readers and critique partners, I usually know if, more than one person, or sometimes even just one person, asks a question, that's usually a sign that I need to clarify. Almost always it's the world building that needs clarified. And then the question that I keep in mind when I'm just going through and doing my drafting is this a piece of information that the reader needs right now? It might be a piece of information that's really important for the overall story, but do they need to know it right now? And oftentimes when I ask myself that question, I find that no, they don't need it right now. It might be helpful, but they don't need it. And so I save it for a place in the story where they really have to have it to make sense of what's going on in the story. And I find that helps a lot to just eliminate all of the backstory that and the backstory is important. And that's stuff that we all need to know. I have a critique partner who loves to write. She used to be a lawyer, and she loves to write legal briefs about her magic systems and her magic world and the characters. And I actually think that's not a bad idea, to write down what you know so you have it somewhere. Just don't put all of that into your story, because you probably don't need most of it.
So true.
It's interesting too, playing with when I'm writing dialogue and when I'm writing scenes, I find that I often have to go back and layer in, what are they doing while they're having this conversation, right? And that's part of the world building that's sort of, it's almost guerrilla world building. Like it's probably not going to be perceived by the reader, and yet it makes the scene 3-dimensional. So I have a scene in a young adult novel where a girl and her mom are having this big fight. But while and the first time I wrote it, it was just sort of happening in this black hole, right? The dialogue was really snappy, and the conversation was working, but there was nothing that anchored them to anything. And when I rewrote it and I put them in the kitchen, and her mom was baking cookies, and interspersing between the dialogue, her mom sprinkling pink sugar on the sugar cookies that are shaped like daisies. Like all of a sudden, there are just these little things that create the world that they're within, that the reader doesn't have to track on that stuff, but it almost allows the reader to then really pay attention to what they're talking about, as opposed to wondering where they are and what's happening around them. So and to your point about revision, there's so much of that you can't do until you go back and revise, because the first time you're writing it, you're concentrating on the conflict that's existing between the characters and the stakes of whatever the problem is. But then you have to go back and you have to add in all those layers in order to create a world that the stakes will be believable within, right?
100%. And I think it's so important that you mentioned such a ordinary scene, because when we say world building, almost all of us think fantasy.
Right.
When
Right.
that is so not the case. It could be as simple as in a scene where two people are just sitting across a table, drinking coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
the other detail that I think we, regardless of what genre we're writing, tend to forget about is the timeline in terms of world building. Look at us all rolling our eyes and cringing,
Yeah.
but it's so true, right? Like that, even if you put it into your first draft, I'm going to wager a guess that 99% of the time it's wrong, or it gets changed, or just isn't there at all. Like when I read Pitch Wars novels, it's amazing to me how often, like, either every single day is Wednesday, or you just have absolutely no idea what day of the week it is, or even what season it is. That's something else that I think a lot of writers don't think about, is how the weather, and when is your birthday, and what holidays are you celebrating? And that's all stuff that can help the world feel more real too.
Well, just look at our four pictures on this call and how different the worlds look in all four. I mean, look, Sam's world and my world are totally different, right? Like really. So just even looking at that and thinking about how would you write each of these four scenes, totally different, right? And yet we're all having the same conversation. But where are the people? What's happening? What's taking place? Who made the choice to hang that thing on the wall, right?
And not only that, but what would your character notice in each of our scenes? So somebody who's a dog lover would immediately gravitate toward the dog in your novel. And somebody who loves dressing up is immediately going to notice Sam's wig. And so it's, that's really an opportunity to look through the lens and decide, what do you call out in your manuscript?
Right. And people who love jewelry are looking at Pael's earrings and
right.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And people looking at my screen are wondering why I'm in the basement on a ping pong table.
But there's a story. There's a good story there, right?
That's the backstory, though. I'm not going to tell anybody.
Right. So to close this out, I mean, I could keep talking to you forever. This is food for me. But to close this out, I would love to hear from each person about another book, not your own, that you think is a really good model for world building for people who want to study it and really look at it with a sort of deconstructing eye to take it apart and figure out how that author did that. And I'll go first because I don't know. Hopefully this isn't one that you're already thinking about, and this is an old one, but for me, the master of world building is J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter. And this is a very controversial thing, what I'm about to say, but for me, the first Harry Potter book is hands down my favorite. And the reason it's my favorite is because of the world building. And Pael, your point about the device of having a character who doesn't know what's happening and has the world unfold. I mean, that's a classic example, right? He doesn't know who he is. He doesn't know what he's capable of. He doesn't know where he's from. So we, as the reader, get to discover it right alongside of him. And I'll never forget the first time I read the scene where he's at Hogwarts and he goes into the dining hall for the opening of school banquet, and the ceiling disappears and becomes stars. And I mean, it is so rich and vivid. And for that reason, it's my favorite book, because all of the other books start to become about the plot and the stakes and everything. But the revelation of the world and the unveiling of the world, to me, was so masterful and so unforgettable. So that's my not favorite, but that's the one that comes to mind every time I think about masterful world building. So what about the rest of you?
Well, so I could not agree more. It's really sad that it has become such a controversial thing to talk about, because so much of our books, I feel, and our journeys as writers have been influenced by her and the Harry Potter books. But you cannot take away from the fact that she outdid herself with the world building there. And it influenced a lot of how I approached my world building in Rhea and the Blood of the Nectar. But another book that really influenced me in terms of world building and characters, creating friendships and all of that, was his Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman. I love that book, those books. And I remember when I read them, it was a long time ago, but like I remember small instances, like when Lyra sort of enters into the other world and they slit the air. I actually pay homage to that in my book in a very small scene, but I could feel it. I could see it. I could envision them, parting this veil between the worlds. And it was like you had mentioned before, Megan. It took advantage of all the five senses, and I think that is so crucial for fantasy or contemporary, just general world building. So yeah, for me, it's Harry Potter as well as his Dark Materials.
Great.
One of my favorite books with outstanding world building is Danielle Clayton's The Bells. Just the majesty and the detail of that world that's just revolves around these concepts of beauty and how they use the young girls in order to create beauty, and the class systems that are based on these concepts of beauty. It's so rich, so detailed, so thought-provoking and profound. And then down to little things like the teacup animals. I want a little teacup dragon. It's just too cute. Like there's so much going on in the world of the Bells. And so I'm ever since I read that, Danielle Clayton is absolutely just a pinnacle of world building mastery for me.
I would absolutely agree with that. I actually couldn't decide, so I picked two. I cheated a little bit, and I also brought pop props. So the first one is A Wish in the Dark, which just won the Newbery Honor. And man, this book is just masterful. Like right from the opening scene when she's describing the mango and the mango tree, and later on when you're in the city and the magic and the feel of the magic, and everything about it is just so rich and so immersive, and none of it feels telly at all. So if you're looking to study a class act in fantasy, I would definitely point you toward that one. And then I just read a book this week that I found absolutely fascinating. It's called The Hedgehog of Oz, and it's by Corey Leonardo. It's her second book. And this book is about a cute little hedgehog with glasses. But the really interesting thing to me is that it opens up describing setting for something like 5 pages, which almost never happens in a middle grade novel, or really many stories. Like we're always told we need to meet the character right away. But she spends 4 or 5 pages introducing us to a movie theater. And the description and the setting is there's so much tension woven into it, and you can just feel it and taste it and see it and smell it that you can't put it down even though you haven't met the main character yet. So that's one worth studying just to see how she got away with that. Also, really fantastic book.
So I noticed that all of the books we just talked about have magical and fantastical elements. So I'm going to throw one more out there that is realistic, just to make the point that we made earlier, that world building has to happen everywhere. And that is, it won the Newbery, oh gosh, maybe 10 or more years ago, by Susan Petrone. It's called The Higher Power of Lucky. It's a middle grade story. It's a quiet, wonderful story about a little girl who lives with her foster mother in a very small community in the desert. And it's one of my favorite books. And it's one that the world is built entirely out of the physical geography where they're set and the relationships of the people one to another. It reminds me a little bit of Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate DiCamillo, in that it's also sort of small town interrelationships between people, interesting, quirky characters who create this larger world in which the story takes place. No magic whatsoever, and yet really rich 3-dimensional worlds in which the characters live, and all of the skill and the craft that we've been talking about today is present in those books as well. So there are a couple. They aren't terribly contemporary because they've been out for quite a long time, but definitely worth studying for realistic contemporary world building as well.
Well, if I could just jump in and mention one more, Megan.
Yeah, please.
Can I do
Jessica.
that? One of our fellow 20 Wonders, I just finished her book last night, and that's Glitter Gets Everywhere. I don't know if the rest of you have had a chance to read it yet. It comes out soon. And the world building, it's a contemporary, it's just fantastic. It starts in England and then it moves to New York City. And I find oftentimes when books start in one place and move to another, it can be really hard to feel completely engaged in both settings. And she does a really, really fantastic job of that. So that's a more contemporary, realistic story that would be great to study for setting and world building.
Say the title again and the author, just so that people hear it.
The title is Glitter Gets Everywhere, and I don't know how to pronounce the author's name. Does anybody here know how
Yvette.
to pronounce her name?
Yvette?
Yvette. I say
Yeah.
Yvette. Sorry,
Yeah.
Yvette. I
Yeah.
think so, Yvette.
Yeah,
We all correspond with each other so much. We don't talk to each other.
No.
that's right.
all
That's
written.
right.
Yeah.
Sorry, Yvette. I hope I got it right, but I love your story.
Yay. That's
Like,
great.
It's like reading characters and character names in a book, right?
Right.
It's
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
absolutely. Yeah.
Right. I remember when Harry Potter first came out and people who had never been to England said Hermione. They pronounce,
Hermione.
my
I know.
students at the time would say Hermione because they'd never
Oh
ever
my
heard the
gosh.
name Hermione. But it's, phonetically, if you follow the rules
It's
of
Hermione.
written, it's Hermione. So there you go.
That was one of the, how to pronounce my main character's name was probably the hottest point that my editorial team and I contested, because his name is Gage and my book has footnotes, and I absolutely insisted that we have a footnote telling the reader how to pronounce it. And one of the managing editors just kept insisting that we take that out, that everybody would know how to pronounce it. And so I asked a whole bunch of middle grade readers, like I wrote it out, how do you pronounce that? And every single one of them pronounced it differently. So even as adults and writers, we think that everybody's going to know a word, but children oftentimes haven't been exposed to those words or names. So
Yeah.
something to keep in mind.
When my audiobook narrator was getting started on recording my book, my editor sent me a message and she's like, oh, she just has a few questions on pronouncing some words in your book. And it was like at least 30 names and words, like including like many of the words I had made up for the book. And I was laughing. I was like, just a few questions, huh? But I was really happy that she took the time and the attention to detail to make sure she got the pronunciation right on so many of these words. So
Did you actually get to talk to her then? Did you have a conversation with her?
I did not. I recorded just me saying the name of all of them. I mean, it took like an hour to just go through and say everything.
Did you ever fumble on them, Sam? Because that's happened to me sometimes. I mean, you concoct these really cool looking names, and then when it comes to actually pronouncing it in a public setting, oh, I remember for the rad readings, I was just like, why have I chosen this?
It made me realize, I was like, oh no, now I have to tell people how to pronounce them. I mean, in another story I'm working on, my Icelandic fantasy, I made the name of this witch's prison, and it's a made up word, but it's intentionally looks Danish because Denmark ruled over Iceland at the time. I don't know how to say it. I can't even remember how to spell it. Every time I would write it in the manuscript, I have to go back. And yeah, so if that book gets published and gets made into an audiobook and then they say, how do you say this word? I'm going to be in trouble.
You have to figure it out before then.
Because I got to learn something.
That's great. Well, thank you all so much for taking this time. It's really great to be with you. And I hope this panel is helpful for those of you out there who are working on your own world building. And of course, we're all online. You can find us on socials or on our websites if you want to reach out, if you have questions. And we hope you'll look for our books and have a great day. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thanks so much.